Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for joining another podcast in our series called Detox. I'm really excited today to have with us Hamza Farrukh, who is the founder of a fantastic water charity that's provided, and Hamza is going to give the details, that provides water to underserved communities, and they are committed to bridging the sustainability gaps and are a key player in the wash sector. So, Hamza, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
Doing very well, man. Doing even better now that I'm here speaking with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Hamza, we are huge fans of the work you're doing. I mean, this is an area that requires a lot of effort, I'm sure globally, but in Pakistan, because we've seen what the floods have done in the country. So, I mean, we're going to get into the business. We're going to talk about Bondh E Shams and what it stands for, what the name means. But first, let's talk about you, Hamza. Where do you come from? What was the environment like where you grew up?
Yeah, no, I think it's always good to start with a personal story. I think for most people listening, my story is very similar to yours. I grew up in Pakistan. I was, my father was a doctor in the army, so we kept moving around the country. Every 3 years, it was a new city. So I've lived in 5, 6 different cities across Pakistan. Never lived in the city for more than, I think, 3 years, except for Rawalpindi, which it was 5 years. And I was proud to call myself a Pindi boy for those years. 2011, I got a chance to study abroad, went over to the US, Williams College. I was there for 3.5 years, was at Oxford for 1 year, worked in New York for 1 year, moved to London now 6 years ago. Been in London working at Goldman Sachs. And then Bondh E Shams, the charity, was really a personal project. It was a way to ensure that I was not part of the statistics when they talk about brain drain. I think the idea was to subvert and change the narrative. You could be doing whatever else you want professionally, but you can still give back. And I think what's happened over time is that small passion project, that small statement has become basically my life's mission. And here we are talking about it.
Sometimes the universe enacts its forces in interesting ways, and here through you. So, what was the inspiration with Bondh Shams? What led you to this idea? Where did you find that problem and you addressed it?
Yeah, so look, I think growing up in Pakistan, we, it's no sort of hidden secret. It's no secret that poverty exists, right? Poverty is front and center. We are a developing nation. And growing up, I was very well aware that, more needs to be done. The question often becomes who's supposed to do it, right? And I think there's an inflection point that happened personally for me, where after I'd graduated, was in university, I would often come back to my old school. I'd come to Roots, I'd come to Beacon House, and I give these, small talks to other students saying who were interested in getting university admissions abroad. And I would say, you guys are extremely lucky. If you are in high school, if you're in college, you're part of the 1 or 3% of the entire population, your age in Pakistan, that is getting a university education. So if you're part of that 1% that is getting the privilege of a great education, right, then how could you even think and look around when you say, who's supposed to do it? Of course you're supposed to do it, right? That's what you're supposed to do. That is, literally, that is the purpose of the privilege you have. So I think for me, it was really sort of understanding the construct of poverty. Nobody is an expert, but to get a better understanding of what was needed, making sure that it wasn't my idea of what was needed, it was a bottoms up solution, and then just finding a way to connect the dots, right? So I think it wasn't, and I would like for people to understand that it wasn't that giving clean water was my passion, right? Water is a start. Water is fundamental. Water is a foundation. Water is apolitical. Water is so apolitical, people don't like to talk about it, right? And I used to say this, and I don't know if the viewers will like to hear this, but my initial pitch was water is not sexy. And because it is not sexy, that's why nobody talks about it, right? So, and the reality is that 20 million Pakistanis, right, that lack access to clean water. There are 1.2 billion people in the world, right? 1 out of every 10 that lack access to clean water. And In Ramzan particularly, we're very well aware that without water it becomes hard to function, without caffeine it becomes hard to function. But these are communities that have learned to live that way. These are communities that have adapted to that life. And I think the question was, if you were going to give back to Pakistan, to the country, where would you begin? Of course, you would begin with off-grid communities. If you begin in off-grid communities, what problem do you begin with? Of course, you begin with water. And it was after we did the first project that I realized that we were catalyzing the kind of change which even personally as a founder I hadn't envisioned. Right? With water, you gave people access to an education because the children who were having to walk long distances to gather the water could now instead choose literacy. Right? We empowered the women in the community who were often tasked with collecting water. Right? So, and what that really does is, and again, I always pause when I'm sharing this story because it's more an anecdote. But from a metadata standpoint, from a macro standpoint, when you do these interventions, you expect to see positive changes in the literacy rate. You see positive changes in the global economy. You see in the Pakistan's national economy, because you're really empowering the domestic sector to reach its full productive capacity. And my experience with this project has been unique because I'm an economist by training. I studied economics and political science. At Goldman, I've focused on macroeconomics and applied macroeconomics, understanding of the global financial system. So when I talk of these things, it is important, I think, for the audience to understand that this is not the founder of a water charity speaking. It is a trained economist and a financial expert who's lending credibility to the cause of safe water and saying, if you begin with that, I think there's hope for many more solutions down the line.
Wow, this is so good to get this little peek into your mind. I mean, an economist trying to solve the water problem, and I love what you said about the ripple effect that happens. I mean, you bring this one thing in that those communities. There's so many probably unexpected things that start changing around it. But as I'm sure you're aware, launching a startup has challenges. Maybe more so in a country like ours. So, what was it like? I mean, from conceiving this idea to where you are today, what were those big milestones along the way?
Yeah, and I think great question because I'm fortunate to be speaking from a position of relative success. I don't think we are anywhere close to where we need to be. Uh, you know, Having said that, I think the initial years were really challenging, and there are multiple different issues you face along the way, and these issues aren't unique to me. I'm sure almost every founder in a startup, business owner faces similar challenges. First is the challenge of infrastructure, right? I think if you're trying to get registered as a business, if you're trying to especially get registered as a social enterprise or as a nonprofit, there are way too many hurdles. And I was lucky to be speaking at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute earlier this morning, and I just said, look, when you ask me for policy recommendations, when you ask me what should the government be doing to facilitate startup founders, my question to you is, why are you asking me? You've got trained policymakers that are meant to do this as their job, right? Why is a 19-year-old or 20-something supposed to know who to go to in the government, right? Why isn't your infrastructure and budget being spent to empower us? Either get us the exact information or have programs that seek out such people and empower them. And yes, you've set up some programs, but the proof is in the pudding. If those programs are successful, you wouldn't have had people like us, who've made it somewhat, well, with the resource available. And the unfortunate reality is, and I'm sure a lot of people in the infrastructure will agree with me here, our success is not because of the infrastructure, right? Because that's often what they say, like, oh, you made it, clearly it works. It's not because of it, it's in spite of it, right? And I think that's very important because when you don't give the right resources, you create a hustle culture. You create a culture where you're just trying to figure it out, where you look around, you ask friends and family, and you try to bootstrap yourself, right? This idea of venture funding, this idea of getting cash influx to help your startup it remains a distant dream for most founders in the country because we don't have accessibility to the global financial system, you know. And what people don't seem to understand is, and I hope for policymakers to understand this, is the fact that when you have a country that is, for the lack of more diplomacy, quite corrupt, at least at the level where people are looking at, right? Nobody's going to trust what the government, sitting government, is saying. What they're going to trust is what the corruption index is saying, right? If you have that, the 220 million Pakistanis that live in this country, when they try and tap the international system, they're going to be looked at it with the same lens, right? Nobody's going to cut slack to the Pakistani founders if the country isn't strong enough. So what people have to understand is, when you talk about a political crisis, when you talk about an economic crisis, we talk about a security state problem, these things affect every single one of the startups in Pakistan. Because, and I will say that I was plugged enough into sort of the policymaking infrastructure a couple of years, at least I was keeping myself updated. The state bank made some really good moves to try and allow startups to be able to connect. There were some legal implications that were resolved on the back of it. There are some great people who did some work around it. And the result was that you found better ways to connect, but then those disappear, right? Almost immediately, especially in a country which is so exposed to, foreign exchanges. If you're trying to get funding and suddenly your rupee depreciates 30 or 40%, I mean, how do you make up for that loss? And again, this is a result of the geopolitical, implications that the country has to deal with. So I think, in long-winded answer, but the reality is, when you're setting up a business in Pakistan, you face an infrastructure problem, you face an image problem. Then within Pakistan, what you often face is a credibility problem, where everybody has an idea, but so few people have ways to implement it. That becomes difficult for folks to figure out which ones to back. So I think really, and I think the exception to this, what I found in my experience is, since we've moved to the National Incubation Center and have been partnering with NIC, the dialogue is very different, right? Because NIC has found a good way to help at least some people with good ideas, right, rise to the challenge and have these conversations. But the reality is, and this is probably the broader, the look we need to take inside. The reality is, Pakistan is a deeply aggregating society, right? Pakistan is a textile-based society. Pakistan is agricultural-based. And we need to find a way to make that pivot, right? And I was saying this earlier again to someone, Pakistan's biggest export over the last 75 years remains textiles. It is still today, right? It need not be the case for the next 75 years, because we're not talking about splitting that same pie. We're not saying reduce the textile sector and do something else. We're saying increase the size of the pie. And you can by making these big pivots. The big pivot, and I will share this one stat, which is Pakistan's export in IT last year was around 3 to 4 billion, 3.5, I believe it was. India's was 160 billion, right? So it was 50 times higher for a country, 4 to 5 times more. So this gap, and I like to compare ourselves to India, not because it's a competition, because it's a healthy competition. We are okay to compete on development. We're okay to compete on education in the right metrics. So it is good to have that framework, that it is possible for the same kind of demographic, right? So we may not have been able to, we would like to not catch up to them, right? It's a bigger economy on the IT side, but the shape and feel and look of IT will change in the next 10 years. We've all been talking about AI. Everybody's trying to figure out what's happening, right? The reality is, the infrastructure that is needed to be part of the AI revolution already exists in Pakistan. You need internet connectivity. You need tons of people to feed into these large language models. And you need a lot of people who are hungry and hustlers to understand what's happening. And what they say is, AI will not replace you. Somebody who knows how to use AI will replace you. So why can't, folks within Pakistan be those people? We can set up AI training centers. Inshallah, it's one of the things Bondh E Shams hopes to start as well. And the idea, again, when we talk about Bondh E Shams, it's not just water. We're starting with water as the point, right? So we want to do everything possible to empower all of us who want to add to the domestic and the local and national economy, because I think that will change the narrative in a big
Absolutely.
way.
And there's no, what you said, there's absolutely no harm in taking inspiration from the countries around us, seeing the kind of work they're doing. We have Bangladesh doing some fantastic things. You gave the example of India. And I keep coming back to what you said about the ripple effect. And even in this case, what you said about startups having to hustle, I mean, and that's stemming from somewhere else. If you give them the right environment, like you get here at the NIC, you're able to gain access to all the tools. It should be seamless. It should be seamless. And I hope our listeners include some of those policymakers who can take inspiration from your brilliant words. A lot of drops of wisdom. Let's talk about these communities. What does Bondh E Shams mean as a word? And then let's talk about the communities that you've served. When you come into those communities, where are they? What are they like? How many have you served? And where is it going to keep going from here?
Sure. Um, so we tend to focus primarily on off-grid communities, and by off-grid I mean they are, facing the problem of water, but they're also facing the problem of lack of electricity, the lack of infrastructure. We're talking about communities around Thar. We're talking about communities around Umarkot in Sindh. We're talking about communities in Hub, Balochistan, Bela, Balochistan. We're talking about Lucky Marwat in KPK,
All across
Naushera, all across the
Pakistan.
country, right? So we began our work in Punjab. Then we very quickly realized that the need in Sindh and Balochistan was higher. During the floods, we were quite proactive, and we deployed around 25 clean water projects. Here, the construct of the Oasis box, which is a solar powered water extraction and filtration and storage system, became one of the most flagship disaster relief interventions. Not just in Pakistan, I was flown out to the United States. I presented at the Coca-Cola headquarters, where they realized that this technology actually has implications and can be utilized for the southern part of the United States as disaster relief. So thankfully, because we make these devices within Pakistan, we made them available almost immediately, and we're able to help communities in that regard. So, in our journey, we've deployed 101 projects as of this past weekend, and we're talking almost around 150,000 people daily. From our estimate, and these figures, have some band of error. We provided almost 100 million cups of clean water since 2014, and the vision and the hope for Bondh E Shams has been quite simple, which is I shared the fact that the problem, which is many Pakistanis not having access to clean water, but the design solution that we brought to the front, it is meant to cater to a lack of electricity. It is meant to cater to a lack of clean water. And it is a design solution, I keep stressing, because it is meant to be highly scalable. The issue which I realized very early on in our time with Bondh E Shams was that conventional solutions, including hand pumps and the solar powered RO plants, they were just not going to cut it. And the reason was hand pumps do not filter water, which is why, despite massive investments globally in hand pumps, you still have rampant waterborne disease, right? People, and I think this is this concept within the Islamic giving space of the Sadqa Jariyah. We need to change that a bit in the sense that we need to enrich it with a better technology. The last major upgrade in the hand pump design was done in the 1970s. So the Oasis box actually helps plug that investment and innovation gap by utilizing bacteria removing filters. And on the conventional implementation side, what I'll say is the first project that Bondh E Shams did, it took me almost 2 to 3 weeks to install it, right? And we used solar panels, we used contractors for filtration, this and that. And my question was, and my thought was, well, even if I found all the funding in the world, right, at this model, I would need hundreds of people in the organization to be able to do more than 10 projects a month, right? Because I'm talking about one project independently taking 10 people and then, taking me 3 weeks to implement, 4 weeks to implement. So there needs to be a scalability intervention. There needs to be a design intervention. So the construct of the Oasis box was something which could be transportable. It was mobile. It was on wheels. It could be, and I gave a TED talk in 2019 called "The Solving the Global Water Crisis in 7 minutes," right? Because the Oasis box can be installed in 7 minutes and deliver clean water. So I think that's our vision around it. And I think we've grown from doing 4, 5, maybe 10, 15 projects a year to now doing. I think last year we did 48 projects. In the last 1 month, we've done 40 more. So we're rapidly scaling up. We're rapidly. So I'll give one example. And I think this should really help set the tone. This past weekend, in 3 days, we deployed 10 projects, right? So when we talk about scaling, we've solved the most important part of the problem, which is the puzzle was how do you make it implementable? How do you make it scalable? How do you make it design coherent? And we've solved that problem with the funding that we had. Now we're talking about scaling, right? And the scaling part now that's left is the funding. And for anybody listening, this is not a pitch to give us funds, right? We've unfortunately tried the Pakistani government. We've tried like all these different departments. We're only calling on folks who are seriously interested in solving the problem. We're not asking people to contact us if they want kickbacks. We're not asking them to contact us if they want discounts. If you're serious about solving Pakistan's water crisis, come to us. Because we're hoping to, inshallah, become, my brother keeps saying, the problems of tomorrow cannot be solved by tools of the past. We have a tool of the future. Join us, inshallah, we can make a real big dent.
It's phenomenal. That's a fantastic call. Talking about this water problem, this is a huge problem, and it's global, and it's in Pakistan. What are some of the stats and figures around this? How much water do we have? How much time do we have? And so this is one of the solutions. Are there additional solutions that you're going to be working on as well? Like, for example, taking ocean water and filtering that. Are these some things we can work on?
Yeah, so look, I think Pakistan's water crisis is manifold, right? And I think I've been the first one to say it is not one organization's job to solve it, neither can it, right? So what we're doing is actually, removing the pain points immediately because there are people dying from the lack of clean water. But for a coherent long-term solution, you need a national revamp of the water policy framework, right? Which needs to take into account the Indus Basin, which needs to take into account the Indus Water Treaty and what's happening. The international bodies have now taken a pause on their intervention capabilities around it, which is really bad news for Pakistan. So we need to have dialogues with the neighbors to figure that out. We need to figure out how to ration out the water within our provinces. We need to figure out why we're letting these companies extract water for free, right? Because probably Pakistan is one of the few countries where access to clean water from underground is actually free of charge.
And we're losing our underground reserves.
Aquifers are quickly depleting. Pakistan is the 4th or 5th most water-stressed country in the world, right? So it is time for a national discourse on clean water access. And the solutions that come on the back of them, right, back of these decisions, will again be manifold. So there will be space and time for the work we're doing, right, which is now to help save lives, which is again, crisis situation. There's also a dialogue that needs to happen more broadly. And what I will add is the solutions will likely not be conventional the way we think of them. So what I mean by that is as follows. What we've developed with Bondh E Shams is hardcore infrastructure to filter and provide water. But what we're embedding within that infrastructure is sort of a device which collects information on how much water is used, the quality of that water, geolocation of these projects. Such devices, from my standpoint, should be introduced across Pakistan on all our farms, within our households. The device itself, we're making at the moment in Islamabad again. And the idea is to collect data, to get a better understanding of how much people are utilizing, and then figure out how to ration it out, which provinces need what, and how to mobilize resources. So again, it's a big data exercise. At the same time, what will likely happen is as you get more data, you'll be able to embed better systems on it, and then there's a space for innovation, such as, running these machine learning models to figure out, what to trigger and when. So it's a much bigger conversation. But I think spot now, what is needed is for people to wake up, because I understand, all of us have limited bandwidth to focus on issues. At the moment, the entire country is embroiled in a balance of payment and a balance of trade crises. We've got an economic crisis brewing, we've got a political crisis. So our bandwidth is going there. But as we resolve those issues, let's also realize there are millions of Pakistanis that couldn't care less about what's happening in the Senate and the Parliament. What they're focused on is how they're going to feed their children the next
How
day.
they're going to survive. Everyone's in
So,
survival mode.
exactly. And I think it is the responsibility for those in the halls of power. It is a responsibility for those of us with a good education. It is a responsibility for those of us who have been privileged enough to have these resources to think more broadly.
Impactful words, Hamza. And on that note, anything you'd like to say to startup founders out there who are looking to work around climate change and achieving SDG goals, and in the space that you're working in?
Yeah, so look, I think the biggest thing which is coming up in this space is climate finance. So, as an example, at Bondh E Shams, we're running an active research and development effort on getting registered with the UN gold standard as a climate offset project. And there's a huge opportunity within carbon finance, especially for a country like Pakistan that is massively exposed to climate infrastructure in the climate crisis. And what that really means is there are ways with the global financial system where you can be compensated for offsetting negative impacts on the climate and on the planet. And if and I this these would be my words of encouragement to anybody in Pakistan who's thinking of startup ideas and trying to where to focus their energy. There's tons of funding available, and there's a lot of space. There's a big vacuum of work that needs to be done within climate finance. Nobody has global leadership on that topic yet. I think Pakistan has a big opportunity. We've already been in the news around the floods, right? Because that got tied back to climate change. And I think now is our time to make a pivot and offer solutions as well, right? Funding is only one thing. What you need are credible, long-term, solid projects, right? And I think anybody in the infrastructure would agree with that. So I would say I think finding where to focus your energies is quite important. And I think again between AI and climate financing, those are great subsets to pick up at least as a starting point because they meet all the right metrics. And then I think you're going to need a lot of perseverance to make it across. And until there are big infrastructural policy changes, which again, I think, being cautiously optimistic, hopefully they happen. But until they realize, you will have to persevere. And I think you will have to lean on each other. I think they've always said strong, society, weak state. That's fine. So when you hear these words, reach out to Bondh E Shams, reach out to myself.
How do people reach out to you?
So the best way would be on LinkedIn. I'll try to make myself or the team available, or come find us at the National Incubation Center in Islamabad. There's a team here, and we're happy to assist. And I think my sort of focus, my takeaway, hopefully for folks listening, would be again remember that for me, Bondh E Shams is an example of what is possible when the youth of this country comes together and applies deep thinking and deep focus to solving any problem. We've got all the right, sort of ingredients to be a big global success. What is needed is for us to understand the very simple, thing that even if we don't get the support from policymakers and the government, which ideally we should, success is still possible. And the revolution that needs to happen has to be led by leaders within the startup and the economic space, because if we strengthen ourselves economically, everything else will follow. So the global diplomacy that is needed is not security diplomacy, it is not political diplomacy, it is economic diplomacy, right? So economic diplomacy needs a strong support from its population, and it needs strong thinking from those of us.
Fantastic, Hamza. We do this thing at the end called the quick fire. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, just to get a couple more insights about you. What's your favorite water body in the world?
What's my favorite water body in the world?
Is there a lake or maybe a sea?
Yeah, look, I think I was very lucky to actually be in Turkey last summer. There is a place called the Butterfly Valley. If you get a chance, check it out. You travel to Fethiye, you take a small boat, and it takes you to a small secluded valley. And the valley opens into the ocean. So when you catch the sunset there,
Oh, that sounds
it's
phenomenal.
it's the water, it's the sun, both things come together. It's basically Bondh E Shams.
Oh, that's brilliant. Bondh E Shams. What's your favorite book? Something you'd like to recommend for us to read?
Yeah, so I'm a big nonfiction reader. I've picked up sort of a few books that I've really enjoyed. One that I would really recommend is by this, former FBI negotiator called "Never Split the Difference." It's a book on negotiation, and I think it has real insight into how the human brain functions when we're in the middle of a negotiation. And I found it quite useful, not necessarily because it's dogmatic and it tells you exactly what to do, but how to think of it, right? And I think that is, and what we tend to realize is every day we're negotiating. It's not just when you're negotiating a price. It's like when you come into the office and you're at the traffic stop. I mean, today I got stopped by the police officer who said,
It's a negotiation,
no,
wasn't
so
it?
he said, the windows look tinted. There's going to be challan. And I said, look, running late for a podcast. Can I do it on the way back? And he said, well, you're going to have to leave your ID card. I'm like, that's okay. If you really want to keep it, that's fine. But I was going to come anyways. He looked at me. I looked at him. He was like, keep the card. And today help me build trust by coming back. I was like, that's fine. So on the way back, I'm going to get a challan as well.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I like that. Oh. What is your retirement plan, Hamza?
There is no retirement plan for now. There's no retirement plan. I
Work,
think
work, work. Lot to be done. Got to save this planet.
gotta save this plan. Look, man, I think I was very lucky to, I think, found my calling and purpose very early on. Right. So I was 21 when I started Bondh E Shams. I turned 30 last month. So thank you very much. And it's the ninth birthday for Bondh E Shams as well this August. So we are knee deep into the work. Alhamdulillah, I think have many more productive years ahead of me. The plan is, inshallah, later this year I will be traveling and joining the Stanford or Harvard School of Business. I have admissions there, so inshallah, want to develop on my own leadership skills and my competence, and bring back more to our community. But I think I will retire whenever the work is done. So if that happens in 10 years, I'm happy to retire. But there's work to be done.
Hamza, words, I cannot express how brilliant it was having you on the show today and how good it is to know that there are people like you out there doing the good work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being here today, Hamza. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Until the next time, see you later.